For 3 long years, a dog waited by an old, abandoned door, holding on to a love that was never coming back, alone, forgotten, but still hoping. Until one day a stranger walked by, and in that brief moment, everything changed. The door would never open again, but the dog's heart had room for a new beginning, if only someone would stop. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalk. In the quiet suburban neighborhood, where the pace of life moved like the slow rhythm of a heartbeat, there was one thing that always remained constant. The dog. Every day, without fail, the small brown dog with a scruffy coat and soulful eyes could be seen sitting by the same door. The door was the kind that looked like it had been forgotten by time, its chipped white paint a reminder of neglect. There was no one who lived there anymore. The house had been empty for what felt like years, but still, the dog waited. For 3 years the dog had sat there, staring up at the old wooden door, watching for any sign of movement. At first, people walking by had taken notice. They'd stop and offer a soft word, a stroke of the dog's fur, but eventually they would keep walking. The dog was just part of the landscape now, a forgotten figure in a forgotten place. But for the dog, that door held a memory, a promise, a hope. It wasn't always like this. There had been a time, long ago, when the dog had a family. A woman, a man, and 2 children. The kind of family you see in picture frames, smiling and carefree. The dog had belonged to them, loved them with a loyalty that only animals seem capable of. Every evening the family would gather on the porch, laughing and talking as the dog sat happily at their feet. It was a life that seemed unbreakable, a love that seemed eternal. But then one day the family was gone. The woman had passed away first. The children had moved away to start their own lives, and the man had simply disappeared, leaving behind only the dog, who waited faithfully by the door for the return of the ones he loved. At first, the neighbors thought it was just a temporary thing. The dog would wander off, maybe looking for food or water, but always return to the same spot, as though drawn by some invisible tether. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and the dog never strayed too far. He would lie down on the porch, his eyes never leaving the door, as if waiting for a reunion that would never come. But then, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, as the dog sat there, his tail wagging faintly at the sound of approaching footsteps, a man paused in front of the house. He was tall, wearing a faded jacket and a weathered cap, carrying a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. The man had been walking for hours, passing through the neighborhood on his way to somewhere else, when something stopped him. He had seen the dog before, of course, but this time something was different. The dog's eyes so full of unspoken hope seemed to reach out to him. The man knelt down slowly, unsure of how to approach. The dog's fur was matted, his ribs visible under the thin coat, but there was a dignity in his eyes, a quiet strength that spoke volumes. "Hey there, buddy," the man murmured, his voice low and comforting. The dog's ears perked up, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. It was as though the dog had been waiting for this exact moment for all these years. The man extended a hand cautiously, and the dog, after a brief hesitation, nuzzled into it. The touch was tentative at first, but then, as if realizing that this moment was something he'd been waiting for, the dog leaned in, his whole body trembling with emotion. For the first time in 3 years, the dog wasn't alone. The man stood up, taking a deep breath. He glanced around at the empty house, its windows dark and unwelcoming. There was no one here to call the dog's name, no one to invite him inside. "Guess you're waiting for someone, huh?" the man said softly, his words more to himself than to the dog. but the dog didn't seem to care. He just kept his eyes locked on the man, as if sensing that this was the moment his loneliness had ended. And so, the man made a decision. The man stood for a moment, his hand still gently resting on the dog's back. The dog, despite his rough exterior, seemed to be at peace, almost as if he'd been waiting for this simple act of kindness for years. It was clear that the dog was no longer just a stray. He was a sentinel, a silent guardian of a past that refused to fade. The man took a step back, considering the situation. He glanced at the old, dilapidated house again. It had been abandoned for as long as he could remember, but there was something about it now that felt different. The house, with its weathered paint and cracked windows, seemed to carry the weight of countless untold stories, memories of lives once lived and now lost. But the dog, he had been here through it all, his heart tied to a place that no longer existed, waiting for people who would never return. "Come on, buddy," the man muttered, his voice carrying a soft sense of determination. He took a few cautious steps toward the street. "Let's get you out of here." At first the dog hesitated. His paws shifted, his body language uncertain, as though he was torn between following this stranger and staying loyal to the door he had guarded for so long. The man paused, giving the dog time to make his decision. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the dog lifted his head, his eyes searching the man's face for any sign of duplicity. Finding none, the dog let out a soft whimper and took a few slow, tentative steps toward the man. The man smiled, relief flooding his chest. "Good boy," he whispered. They walked side by side, the man's hand still resting lightly on the dog's back. The dog's pace quickened as they moved further away from the house, the familiar scent of the old porch fading with each step. As they rounded the corner of the street, the dog stopped and looked back one last time at the house. His eyes lingered on the cracked door, but there was no hesitation now. With a soft huff, the dog turned his attention back to the man and followed. The man didn't know where they were going, but it didn't matter. He was moving forward and the dog was with him. For now, that was enough. The days that followed were quiet, filled with simple routines. The man, whose name was David, wasn't sure what he had expected when he decided to take the dog with him. But what he found was more than he could have imagined. The dog, whom David had taken to calling Charlie, was gentle and patient, grateful for the smallest gestures of care. Every morning David would wake up to find the dog sitting at the foot of his bed, waiting for him to rise and start the day. Charlie had become his silent companion, his presence a comforting constant in the solitude of David's life. David wasn't a man who had many connections. His life had been one of quiet withdrawal, an existence marked by the ebb and flow of days spent alone. He had moved to the neighborhood a few months ago, escaping a life that had been full of loss. First the death of his parents, then the slow collapse of his marriage. The world had felt too heavy, and he had needed a place where he could be alone with his thoughts. But with Charlie, that loneliness seemed to lift, if only for a little while. Each morning, after a quick breakfast, David would head out for a walk with Charlie. They would pass by the same familiar places, the bakery, the park, the small market at the end of the block. Charlie would trot beside him, his tail wagging as they made their way through the quiet streets. David couldn't help but feel a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The world still felt broken, but there was something about having Charlie beside him that made it a little more bearable. David knew that Charlie was still carrying the weight of the past, though. Sometimes late at night, David would find the dog sitting at the window, staring out into the dark. His eyes, once bright with hope, seemed distant, as if he were searching for something that was no longer there. But in those moments, David, would sit beside him, silently offering his presence, letting Charlie know that he wasn't alone anymore. One evening, as David and Charlie returned from their usual walk, they passed the house once again. The place seemed more forlorn than ever, the door hanging loosely on its hinges, the windows broken and empty. For a brief moment, David could feel the dog's tension rising. Charlie had stopped in his tracks, his body rigid, his gaze locked. On the house, David paused beside him, unsure of what to say. He could see it in the dog's eyes, the pull of the past, the longing for the family that had once been there. "Hey, buddy," David said gently, crouching down to meet the dog's gaze. I know you miss them." Charlie looked up at him, his eyes softening. There was no anger or fear in those eyes, just a deep, quiet sadness. David reached out and scratched behind the dog's ears, the same way the family had once done. It felt like an unspoken connection between them, a shared understanding that sometimes the past could never be fully erased, but it didn't have to define them. "You're with me now," David continued, his voice steady, "and you always will be." With a soft sigh, the dog relaxed, leaning into David's touch. It wasn't the same as the days when the house had been filled with laughter and love, but it was enough. As they turned to leave, David glanced one last time at the abandoned house. The light was fading, and the streets were empty, but he knew something had changed. There had been a time when both he and Charlie had been lost in their own ways, separate, broken beings with no place to belong. But now, they had found each other, and for the first time in years, David felt like maybe he wasn't so alone after all. The next morning, David and Charlie woke early, as they always did. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden light across the streets. It was a new day, one that carried with it the promise of something different. The world still held its wounds, but David had found a companion in Charlie, and Charlie, in turn, had found a new family. David had always believed that things happened for a reason, that sometimes life led you to places you never expected, to people or animals who were meant to be there. He had no idea what had drawn him to the dog that afternoon 3 years ago. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the simple desire to help. Either way, it didn't matter. They had found each other, and that was enough. Together, they were no longer waiting for the past. They were walking into the future, side by side. As the days passed, David and Charlie grew inseparable. The bond between them deepened, each passing moment reinforcing the quiet promise they had made to one another, to never leave the other behind, to carry the weight of the past, but not be crushed by it. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts, a duo shaped by loss but defined by the strength to move forward. One morning, about a month after that first day they had met, David decided it was time to visit the old house one last time. It had been a quiet journey for Charlie, but David knew that this place, this house, was more than just bricks and wood. It was where Charlie's heart had been broken, where he had waited for the family that would never return. But David could see now that Charlie was no longer waiting for them. He was walking with him, creating new memories that had nothing to do with the past. The house and the ghosts of that family no longer had a hold on him. When they arrived, Charlie didn't stop this time. He walked past the house with a calmness in his steps, his tail wagging gently as he looked up at David. The house seemed to acknowledge the change too, its hollow windows reflecting the morning light as if to say goodbye to the past. David stood for a moment, watching the dog move forward, and he realized something profound. It was as though Charlie had given the last of his grief to that house. The waiting was over. The door would never open again, but that was okay. The dog was free now, and so was he. David smiled softly, his heart filled with a quiet joy. "You're home, buddy," he whispered. From that day forward, there were no more trips back to the old house. Instead, David and Charlie spent their mornings in the park, their evenings walking through the neighborhood side by side. Charlie had found his new family in David, and David had found a sense of peace he had long since given up on. Every so often, David would catch Charlie looking out the window in the early morning light, and for a moment, the sadness would return. But it was never as heavy as it once was. There was no longer a door to wait for, no empty promises to hold on to. There was only the companionship of two souls, together but not broken. And as the years passed, the story of the dog who waited by the door became a quiet memory, not of abandonment, but of resilience, of the simple truth that even in the face of loneliness, there could always be a new beginning. That love in all its forms could heal. David and Charlie continued to walk the streets of their neighborhood, a pair of unlikely friends, proof that sometimes the most beautiful journeys begin with a step into the unknown, and neither of them would ever be alone again. As David and Charlie walked away from the house for the final time, a loud creak echoed from behind them. The wind had shifted, and for a brief second, the old door, long forgotten, seemed to rattle on its hinges. David froze, his hand still resting on Charlie's back. The dog turned, eyes filled with a quiet understanding, and for the first time, they both knew that the past was finally at peace. The door, like the ghosts it had held, would stay shut. David tightened his grip on Charlie's collar, pulling him close. "Let's go home, buddy," he whispered, his voice a promise. With one final glance at the house, at the remnants of what was once, they turned side by side and stepped into the future together. The door was closed. The waiting was over,